Hey guys, so today I'm going to be talking about how to start outputting. Now, before I jump in, I just wanted to talk a little bit about my experience with outputting for a little bit. So basically, I was a big fan of the AJAT website throughout my journey learning Japanese. And what my impression was from reading the AJAT website was that if you got enough input, then you would become able to output naturally. And that is true, but I kind of extended that out to if you get enough input, you'll become completely perfect in your output. So if you just get enough input, then you'll become able to output basically like a native speaker. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit. I did have some sort of understanding that in order to get good at speaking, you'd have to practice speaking. But I think personally, looking back, I put too much emphasis on input for too long. Now, if you've only been learning for a couple years, then I do recommend putting a huge amount of emphasis on input, perhaps, not outputting at all, especially in the first couple years. But after a certain point, you have enough foundation and you'll probably want to start actually doing work to help you improve your output, because although you can still get pretty fluent with almost no output practice, and that was my experience, if you really want to get comfortable speaking Japanese and you really want to kind of actualize your potential when it comes to your output, then you're going to have to put a lot of work into that. And what I mean when I say actualize your potential is that, for example, in my experience, I would try to speak Japanese, I'd record myself and listen to it back, and I would notice all these problems with my Japanese. And these were problems that were very obvious to me, very apparent. Like, oh, I didn't pronounce that word correctly right there. Or like, oh, I said that word with the wrong pitch accent. Or, oh, why didn't I use this expression instead of that expression? Or whatever. And so, when you have so many flaws in your output that you're aware of, it really just feels like you're not actualizing your potential, because it's like, oh, I can see what's wrong here. I could easily fix it. Whereas, for example, if you do actualize your potential, you still might have a lot of problems with your output, but those are going to be beyond your perception, right? You're going to listen to yourself back and you're not going to be able to find very much that's wrong with your output. You're going to have to go to natives and get feedback in order to find that out. And so basically, if you want to get to that point, it takes a lot of practice. If you don't put a lot of practice into your output, then you're going to have the experience of, always cringing at your output, noticing countless problems with it, yet, not being able to fix it because you haven't actually, built up any kind of muscle memory in your mouth and kind of mental muscle memory in order to help you be able to speak effortlessly and fluently and things like that. And so with that all said, I didn't do what I'm about to tell you, but I wish that I did. And I've been incorporating more and more of what I'm talking about in the last few months, and I've found myself making huge progress in my output pretty rapidly. And of course, the more input you have gotten up till this point, the quicker your progress is going to be when you output, because you have so much potential to actualize. But I still think from much earlier than what I did, it's probably a good idea to start at least doing things that prepare you for output. And so that's why in the MIA overview, I put adopt a parent and start shadowing at stage 3. And so you're not actually creating your own output yet at stage 3, but those are things that you do to prepare. And I'm going to talk about that more in a second. And then in stage 4, you continue those things, but then you actually start practicing speaking. And there's some things that I'm going to talk about to help you with that as well. So first of all, when you're in stage 3, first what you want to do is adopt a parent. And so as far as I know, this was Katsumoto's idea. I'm using the term that he used. The idea comes from the fact that people tend to talk like their parents, right? Because in your most, formative period as an infant, you hear your parents speak more than anyone else. And that kind of becomes the model that you base your output on. And a lot of times, if you, know someone well and then you meet their parents, you notice like, oh, that's so funny. Your dad talks exactly like you, or you talk exactly like your dad. And so the idea is that you kind of replicate that process intentionally by selecting a native speaker of the target language and trying to get a large amount of your input just from that one person specifically. And then you actually can put some conscious effort into, noticing what all the idiosyncrasies of that person are and trying to mimic those. So basically, first, you want to find a parent. Now, it doesn't actually have to be one parent. It can be multiple people. You can listen to a few people and then try to kind of combine them. I know that Katsumoto had 2 parents. Right now, I have a few people that I use as parents, basically. And I used to think that it would be best to choose basically like a radio show host, because, if you do a radio show, like, first of all, a lot of radio show hosts are kind of comedians, or at least they're funny. So you got to learn how to be funny from the person. They're also obviously going to be good at talking. And you're going to have lots of input available from them, where they're just speaking sometimes a monologue and sometimes dialogues with other people. And so that's one thing you have to consider, right? Is not just, hey, do you want to speak like this person, but also, am I going to be able to get enough samples of this person speaking? And so that's still a pretty good option, I think. If you choose like a comedian who has a radio show, then you can go on YouTube. You might be able to find, like hundreds of episodes of this person just pretty much speaking, either, just monologuing, or either, talking to other celebrities or whatever. And that can be a really good sample. But recently, I've been thinking that YouTubers are probably even more ideal than that, because it's a lot closer to kind of normal speech. Like, if you can find a YouTuber who makes videos where they kind of just talk into the camera, with no script or anything, I think that could be better, because first of all, you get to really see their face and their facial expression and, their body movements. And that's actually pretty important, I've been realizing. And, it's kind of nice that there's just these little 5 to 10 minute, maybe 15-minute segments where you can just say, I'm going to watch one video, And it's very concentrated. It'll just be like them talking for 15 minutes straight. Whereas even with the radio shows, it's like they have commercials, or they might like take breaks for songs, and they might have like little corners and things and kind of gimmicks and stuff. And so I've been using YouTubers recently, and I found that works really well for me. And basically some things to think about when you're choosing a parent is, like, obviously you want them to be the same gender as you, because men and women speak very differently in Japanese. And so if you're a guy and you want to sound like a guy, then you should choose a guy to be your parent. You also want to choose someone that's at least within the same age as you. I'd say within a 10-year range either way, because depending on how old you are, that also changes how you speak and your style of speech and your inflection and things like that, at least in Japanese. And then also just kind of someone who matches your personality a little bit, or at least who you resonate with, right? Someone who you could see, like, feel kind of like, oh yeah, I'd want to talk like that. And I received the question before, like, should you choose someone who kind of seems similar to your personality in your native language? And to that, I'd say not necessarily, because, everyone kind of expresses themselves differently in each language, and you might have a sort of different personality, at least on the surface, in Japanese or your L2 than your native language. So instead of what is similar to you, I would just think more in terms of what would you like to speak like, what do you resonate with in Japanese or your target language? And so you want to choose some parents. If you choose a YouTuber or whatever, like, get as much content from them as you can. There's ways that you can just download entire YouTube channels. So like, I downloaded the entire YouTube channels of all the people that I want to use as parents. And I would say try to listen to them like half the time for your immersion. Like, make listening to your parent half of all your immersion, and then the other half, just the kind of stuff you're doing before, either just because you enjoy it or because it's helping you broaden out what you can understand. So try to listen to your parent as much as you can, active and passive, especially passive, because, you're trying to pick up all their habits, consciously and unconsciously. And so basically, by the time you're doing this, you should be at the point where whoever you chose as your parent, you can understand virtually everything they say pretty easily. Because, if you're still having trouble with understanding, at least with the kind of stuff that you're using as a parent, then you're probably not even ready to be thinking about this yet. So first, just start listening to your parent all the time. Try to notice their idiosyncrasies and things like that. Like, oh, he uses this word a lot. Or, oh, when he's thinking, he says and a lot, but he doesn't say like ano that much. Or like whatever, things like that. And so that's with the parent. The other thing you want to do is shadow. And so, basically what that is you are going to be listening to input in the language, and then in real time, you're going to be repeating it back out. And you're trying to match the inflection as much as possible. And so I'm going to make another video later when I go more in detail into how to shadow and how I shadow, because even like a physical level, it can be pretty difficult to get a setup where you can clearly hear your voice and the voice you're listening to. So that's kind of the idea with shadowing, right? Is like you're hearing the language that you're trying to mimic, and then you're mimicking it in real time. And if there's any discrepancies between the two, you can naturally notice those, and then you'll be able to correct that, right? But it turns out to be pretty difficult to find a setup that really allows you to do this, because if you make the input loud enough that you can hear it clearly, then it kind of drowns out your own voice. But if you turn it down enough that you can hear your own voice, well, now you can't hear the input well enough to really mimic it. So I have some ideas with regards to that I'm going to talk about. But what I would do is, at first, don't actually start with your parents. Start with audiobooks, because audiobooks are, in a way, the easiest thing to shadow, because, the voice actors that read the audiobooks enunciate very clearly, and there's kind of a nice, even pace. It's not too fast, and it's not too slow, and it's very consistent, right? If you're trying to use an anime, then there might be long chunks of time where there's almost no dialogue, or there might be two people going back and forth, and that's kind of awkward to try to mimic, right? But with an audiobook, it's mostly just a monologue. I mean, there's conversations as well, but a lot of the time it's just a continuous monologue. And I think that makes it more ideal for practicing shadowing. And at first, you're not going to be able to keep up at all. You're only going to get a few words per sentence. But as you get better, keeping up becomes easier and easier. And then once you find that keeping up isn't a problem, well, now you can actually start paying attention to how close is my voice to the voice I'm listening to. And so that might take you a while, but what I would recommend doing is 20 minutes every day. And I'm going to talk about this more in a little bit, but I kind of have a routine, a kind of like output training routine, and I would recommend kind of starting as well. So once you get more advanced, you're in stage 3, right? You're going to be relying on the SRS less than you were before. And so you can spend less time on the SRS and then more time doing these kind of activities. And so I always recommend doing the SRS in the morning because then you know it's going to happen, and that's when you are the most fresh. And so I recommend kind of also shadowing in the morning. And so like what I do is I would wake up and then meditate, and then I would shadow for 20 minutes, and then I would do reps. And so that's what I recommend, is just do it for 20 minutes. It's not that much, but it builds up over time, right? Because that's an hour every 3 days. And so before you know it, you'll find that you've shadowed whole audiobooks, right? And so try to get to that point, like I said a second ago, where you can repeat out what you're listening to in real time without that much struggle. And I also just note that when you're doing the shadowing, you don't want to be using any sort of script. You don't want to be looking at subtitles or anything. It's all your ears. You're just listening, and then you're repeating it back in real time. And it's okay if you miss stuff. You just want to keep going. And I would try to use something new every time. I wouldn't try to shadow the same thing over and over, because then you start to remember it, right? And you start to just kind of memorize it through osmosis, and then you're not really listening and repeating what you're hearing. You're just saying what you remembered was said, right? But that defeats the whole purpose. The purpose is that you're listening with your ears and you're repeating what you're hearing. And so I would never shadow the same thing multiple times. I would always just keep using new material and just keep going, and don't worry about how much you miss. And if you actually practice every day just for 20 minutes, but you actually, practice very seriously and you're concentrated, you will improve very quickly. At least that's my experience. And it's actually very satisfying to feel this improvement, because, you think back to like, wow, just a few weeks ago, I was missing a word every other sentence. Now I can do almost the whole thing, no problem. And so that sense of improvement will be very motivating. And so I would recommend doing that for at least try to get like 50 hours of shadowing under your belt while you're in stage 3. So you're listening to your parents a lot, and you're shadowing these audiobooks. And that's basically what you're doing to prepare yourself for output for stage 3. So what that's going to do is it's going to help you get your tongue moving, the shadowing will. And then basically through exposing yourself to your parents, you're basically subconsciously biasing the types of things you're going to say. And you're giving yourself something to mimic so that your style of speech can be more consistent. Like you're not saying something that would be used in a novel, then something that's used in the news. It's like you can kind of model and say, I'm just going to try to talk how this guy talks. And then your style of speech will be consistent. And also, it gives you something smaller to aim for, right? Because when you're just trying to like sound Japanese or whatever your language is, that's a pretty broad target, right? And so it's harder to know when you're nailing it and when you're not. But if you have a parent that say like, I'm trying to talk like this guy, that's a much smaller target. And when you have a smaller target, it's easier to know what you're aiming for, and it's easier to tell whether you're succeeding at what you're aiming for or not. And even if you don't succeed, they say like, shoot for the moon, and even if you miss, you'll hit the stars. Or wait, maybe it was opposite. Maybe shoot for the stars, even if you don't get there, you'll probably still land on the moon. It's like that. It's like, even if you can't sound exactly like your parent, you're much more likely to sound Japanese or like a native speaker of whatever your language is. And so I would do that for stage 3. Think of that as a long-term thing. Like I said, try to get 50 hours of the shadowing. And then what you might also want to add in is, like, this is for if you care about pitch accent and if pitch accent is important to you. Then what you also want to be doing before you start outputting is learning about pitch accent, learning the system of pitch accent. This is for Japanese, obviously. Memorizing the pitch accent of a lot of different words, and then really training yourself to be able to hear the pitch accent. And so if pitch accent is important to you, then you want to be doing that alongside all this other work. And then when you're shadowing, you want to try to make an effort to make sure that you're repeating things back with the right pitch accent. You want to be training yourself to listen for that. And if pitch accent is important to you, then what I would add in addition to the daily shadowing is a period where basically you just read texts out loud, but you're making sure that you have the right pitch accent. So what you can do is you can download a book in text form and then read it like in a computer browser with something like Yomi-chan, so that you can instantly check the pitch accent of words you don't know. And basically the reason for this is that, first of all, it's going to help you build these habits, right? Because you want to build habits of always saying things in the right way. But at first, in order to build those habits, you're going to have to be thinking about, the pitch accent rules and stuff. You're going to have to be remembering like, oh yeah, this verb is that. And when it's in this form, it's going to sound like this. And so basically, if you're trying to practice actually speaking and practicing the pitch accent habits, then that's going to be difficult because now you have to do two things. You have to be thinking about the pitch accent and you have to be deciding what you're going to say and forming sentences and things like that. But when you're reading, you can dump that second half, right? You don't have to come up with your own sentences or anything. The sentences are already there. All you have to worry about is the pitch accent. So you'll, consciously recall the pitch accent, consciously recall the rules, and make sure that you read it the same way every time. And what will happen is that your brain will get better and better at doing this, and you'll make a lot of shortcuts, and it'll get to the point where you don't even really need to think about it anymore. You'll kind of internalize pronouncing things in the right way. And that will take a very long time. It's a very long process, and I'm still in the midst of this process, but I see it starting to happen where, on things where I've made sure that I've said it the right way multiple times, I'm much more likely to say it the right way spontaneously when I'm just, having a conversation and not thinking about the pitch accent. And so that's another thing that you can add is shout out for 20 minutes. And then for 20 minutes, just read and make sure that you are nailing all the pitch accent. And that will be very slow because, you'll be having to look up the pitch accent of like multiple words per sentence, but it's not that bad if you have Yomi-chan. So, I would set the timer, do that for 20 minutes, shout out for 20 minutes, do this for 20 minutes. And also, whenever you're listening to Japanese, try to get better and better at hearing the pitch accent, noticing the pitch accent patterns and things like that. But I'll talk more about pitch accent a lot more in the future. And so basically now you're laying some really strong groundwork. So then by the time you get to stage 4 in MIA, when you're really ready to output, basically I would keep doing all of the stuff that you've been doing, but then add to your routine filming a 5 to 10 minute video of you just talking to the camera, like speaking Japanese to the camera on a spontaneous topic, and then watch that video back. And this, I think, is the best way to start doing output, at least spoken output. If you want to talk about written output, that's a little bit different. I would recommend, just instant messaging Japanese people or starting really slow, making sure that you're only saying things is correct. And there's that process. But kind of separate from that process is the process of actually learning how to speak. And so, what I would do is, you want to build up this morning routine, right, of deliberate practice you're doing to help yourself be able to speak Japanese. And so you can wake up, you can shout out for 20 minutes, you can do that pitch accent kind of dictation or like the pitch accent, reading out loud for 20 minutes. And then you can just film a video of yourself speaking for 5 to 10 minutes and then watch it back. And then total that should take about 20 minutes. But it's very important that you watch the video back because you're going to notice a lot of problems with your output. You're going to notice like, oh, I didn't pronounce that word at all. I felt like I did when I was speaking, but yeah, my pronunciation sucked on that word. Or like, oh, that was a weird way to say it. I should have said it this other way. Or, oh yeah, I couldn't think of a good way to say that. Let me go look it up now, a better way to say that. Or like, oh, I said that word with the wrong pitch accent or whatever. And you're going to notice these things. And then just by noticing them, that's going to make you notice when it's done the right way in your input later. And that's really important because, like, for example, if you wanted to say something, but you couldn't think of a good way to say it, then next time you are listening to your parent or watching a movie in the language, and then you hear a Japanese person say the thing you wanted to say in a very Japanese way, you're like, oh, that's how I should say it. And then next time, you'll probably remember that correct way to say it, and it won't be a problem. And so basically, you get good at output from first finding out what your holes are, and then going to immersion to fill those holes. So if you're just immersing without ever doing any output practice or anything to discover your weak spots, you'll still get better slowly, but you'll basically always have these sort of blind spots, right? That just won't ever kind of work themselves out. In order to work themselves out, you have to basically, first of all, find out what those blind spots are and then pay attention to your input in a more directed fashion in order to find out the correct way to fill those blind spots, and then you can improve. And so basically, I think that for the first probably 6 months, just every single day, film a 5 to 10 minute video of you speaking and then watch it back. And in terms of what you're going to talk about in these videos, just make sure that it's spontaneous. Don't actually think of anything ahead of time. Don't start planning sentences ahead of time. You can think about what you want to talk about broadly, but it's important that it's totally spontaneous because then you're getting a really good sample of your raw ability, For example, if you thought ahead of time in the shower for like 20 minutes what you were going to say in the video, then you're going to sound way better in the video because you already have thought of, ways you're going to phrase certain ideas or constructions or a good structure to your thoughts. And of course, the product's going to be better, But that's kind of a different thing that you're practicing. You're not really practicing speaking off the cuff when you're doing that. You're practicing, giving a performance. And so you really want to just practice being on the cuff. And that will also put you very in touch with how much you suck. Because the reality is you're going to be devastated with how awful you sound. And the reason why this is because, first of all, it takes a lot of practice to get good at output. That's what I said at the beginning of this video. But second of all, because you have such a strong foundation in input, right? Like through stages 1 and 2 of MIA, you were just getting input, you weren't outputting. Then you were doing all this other practice to make yourself more attentive to things during stage 3. So basically, you have a pretty robust internal model of what the language is supposed to sound like. And that model is going to allow you to recognize how far off you are from, what a native speaker would sound like. Whereas if you just took a random, Japanese learner off the street, hate to talk shit, but if you took a random Japanese learner off the street who was mostly just studying for the JLPT and was using Genki textbooks and had very little immersion, if they recorded a video of themselves speaking, listen to it back, they might still think that they suck, but they wouldn't understand the true depths of it, right? Whereas you have such a strong foundation and input, you understand the depths of how much you suck. And that's a huge strength because in order to fix a problem, you have to be aware of the problem, right? And you have to know what it looks like to be fixed so that you know whether you're going in the right direction or not. So basically, you're in a really good position when you are outputting, listening to your output and being very disgusted. But it's important that you do go through that process for 2 reasons. First of all, like I said before, it will help you become aware of your weak spots, and then through that, it will help you fill them. But it's also just very motivating. Like for me, when I started doing this thing where I just speak to myself in the camera pretty regularly and then watch it back, I would get so disappointed, be like, holy shit, I am nowhere near where I want to be. And then later on during the day, when you're thinking, should I watch something in Japanese? Or should I just, watch that interesting English podcast that my friend was telling me about? You'll remember how bad you suck. And then you'll be a lot more motivated to be like, no, dude, I want to get better. I want to actually, be able to get to that level where I can speak just how I want to. And so it's very motivating. But it's also kind of nice because you're still kind of safe in the sense of you're not engaging directly with other people. Whereas when you go try to have a conversation with a real person and you get destroyed because you don't understand them or you sound really awkward, or they don't understand you, or just you have a miscommunication, that can just really knock you down. And sometimes that might be motivating, but other times it might be discouraging. But with this type of thing, I think you have most of the encouraging motivational elements without the kind of discouraging, heart-crushing ones. So I would do that for about 6 months, and then I would start trying to have actual conversations with Japanese people, but maybe only a few times a week at first, because in a way, having a conversation isn't that good of practice. Like the real main point of it is that you find out what your holes are. And then you fill those holes during your active immersion when you're paying attention very specifically. And also what my experience is that talking to people it's kind of like what Katsumoto said. It's like, it really is kind of like the game. It's like, you don't get good in the game, you get good at practice. And then the game is where you show off. But you do definitely need to practice talking to people because that's just different than talking to yourself, right? But you can get really confident talking to yourself and then talk to people. And then maybe when you're getting really serious about nailing your input, like you feel like you have a good foundation in input, like you can speak with proper pronunciation and proper pitch accent, and you know that you can phrase your thoughts in a way that you're comfortable with and sound natural, just it still takes more effort for you to speak, or you feel like you want to be faster, then it's kind of just a matter of drilling it down and be like, okay, I'm going to talk to Japanese people for an hour every day and get to that point where it's totally effortless. But the thing is that if you go into that ultra practice output mode before you have the foundation, then you're likely to build bad habits, right? It's like if you're not happy with your pronunciation, but you just start speaking for hours a day, then you're kind of just going to be nailing in that pronunciation. Whereas if you're doing something like shadowing or like recording a video and then watching it back, it's going to have the opposite effect because you're getting feedback, right? You're putting out some output and then getting feedback and then thinking about how to fix that, then you're going to get better and better. But when you're just talking, you don't get that much feedback. I mean, you can record conversations and listen to them back, and then you get a pretty good effect, but that's normally really boring to do because conversations are long. And so really, I think having real conversations with natives is kind of the place where you learn the more social aspects of communication, which is really important. And you're basically just like nailing in and solidifying all the foundation that you already have. And so I'd say that overall, learning how to output is kind of these 3 stages of, one, the preparation work, where you're doing the shadowing. If you're trying to nail pitch accent, then you want to be practicing reading things out loud at the correct pitch accent to kind of get that muscle memory, that pitch accent muscle memory really into place. And then also listening to your parent, and then adding in the actually filming short videos, watching it back, and then really paying extra attention to the parts of your immersion, especially with your parent, right, that you think you're missing. And then you just go into the drill down mode over there. And once you're in the drill down mode, you might want to get regular feedback from natives and ask what to fix. Because like I said, once you start maxing out your potential, getting to that point where you have fixed all the problems that you're aware of, and that's going to take a very long time. And if you have the true foundation that you should have built in stage 1 and 2, then you should be sounding extremely good by the time you have maxed out your potential. But there'll probably still be lots of things that you can't catch yourself. And that's when you need to go to a native and have them point that out. And you can kind of start that process. But I think a lot of people will already be pretty satisfied by the time they get to that point, because, they'll be able to speak easily, fluently, and in a very natural way. You'll be so close where the few percentages that you're away from a native speaker probably won't bother you. And it'll also just feel like the returns have diminished so much at this point, where it's probably a better use of your time to just do something else than continue to try to perfect your output. But anyway, those are my thoughts as of now. Hopefully that was useful, and good luck, guys.